We are finally wrapping up Beyond Orders Rule 1. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. And it was a long rule, so let's recap in short form. We started this chapter with the story of a client who had a lonely, sad, isolated life who improved when forced to socialize by Peterson. Calling back to some arguments from 12 Rules for Life, Peterson argues that we outsource the problem of our sanity to others, and we need others to think properly. The physical act of pointing at something is said to be roughly equivalent to the words used to represent those objects, and we socially learn the relative value of stuff. The relative values of things leads to a hierarchy of those things due to the differences in value. Being good at playing games is good, whatever these games actually are. We start out at the bottom of the hierarchy, similar to the Fool Tarot card, because we are unskilled and ignorant. Peers are who we can communicate equally with. People at the top of the hierarchy are good, as long as they aren't corrupt or didn't fake their way up there. Conservatives are the ones to judge change as required or not, because they can truly respect the ancestral gift of culture. Which brings us to where we're picking up in this video. So, slight spoilers, but half the fun in these is the journey. The lobsters we meet along the way, right? The reader is probably not pure enough of intent to lead or change hierarchies. To successfully affect change, you must be both creative and conservative, as shown by Harry Potter, Disney's version of Pocahontas, and Jesus. The basic bottom line, then, is that culture needs to be respected and honored, but also creatively and conservatively fixed, respectfully. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Welcome back to this cognitive psychologist finally finishing the first actual chapter of Jordan B. Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. And this has been quite the journey, and we're not even at the alchemy portion of the book yet. So let's get to it! After I mention the merch, because merch, ooh, shiny, acquire shinies and support the channel? Yes. Discount if you're a patron? Good, yes. Alright, quick refresher for the visual shorthand to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm sharing my thoughts, and this is going to be largely unused because there isn't much reference action to be had. Alas. Well, let's find out why we shouldn't carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Maybe. Because doing what others do and have always done so often works, and because, sometimes, radical action can produce success beyond measures, the conservative and the creative attitudes and actions constantly propagate themselves. This have always done so is bugging me. It seems like this is saying that the way we currently do things, excepting the things he rants about on Twitter, is the way we've always done things, which just isn't the case. This was more subtextual, kinda, in the original 12 Rules and gets made much more explicit in this book, but Peterson's traditionalism has been a pretty constant presence throughout both these books. For example, in 12 Rules, Peterson talked about the importance and sanctity of marriage a couple times. He argued that having divorce as an option at all makes people take their marriage less seriously, when really they should view it as being, quote, like the two proverbial cats in a barrel, bound by an oath that lasts in theory until one or both of you die. That oath is there to make you take the damn situation seriously. Another instance came from the parenting chapter, where he tried to make the case that, quote, parents should come in pairs. Anything other than that is doing a disservice to the child. All of this is ignoring the reality of the situation for many people who end up going through a divorce. In the positive end of things, you have two people who just realize that they're not really that compatible anymore. And if you have two adults who are in a legally recognized partnership and they decide, we'd actually be happier and healthier if we weren't in this partnership anymore, we should respect that. It takes a lot of thought and strength to realize that you're in this relationship and no matter what you do, it's not going to get fixed. Why should we force these people to continue to keep this going? On the more negative end of things, you may have somebody who's in an unsafe situation because of their partner, and so they need to get out of that marriage.
forcing them to stay in that relationship because tradition says so, maybe paving the tradition path with broken spirits or blood. The point of this tangent is to say that this tradition is best mindset ignores a lot of the complication that drives change. It also seems like, with how these two are set up, they're almost separate categories or options. In one category is a conservative attitude demonstrated by traditional actions, and in the other is a creative attitude carried out through radical action. Tradition will get you something that'll work, and creativity will possibly lead to a monumental success. Or failure. And on some level, that makes sense. If you take tradition as the safe, reliable solution to a problem, and creativity as giving you something that could surprisingly work, or blow up in your face. But, as my marriage rant hopefully demonstrated, when you put these abstract ideas onto reality, there are human costs we shouldn't lose sight of. Something Peterson hasn't exactly been keen on doing, as he's left things largely abstract.
A functional social institution. A hierarchy devoted to producing something of value beyond the mere assurance of its own survival can utilize the conservative types to carefully implement processes of tried and true value, and the creative, liberal types to determine how what is old and out of date might be replaced by something new and more valuable.
The thought doesn't seem to cross Peterson's mind that the liberal, creative types might not want to act in service of tradition. Although I suppose there is a philosophical discussion to be had about how far a progressive action can go when ultimately constrained by tradition, but let's not disappear up our own asses just yet. This is the closest we come to a concrete idea of what he's meaning by social institution. These are social hierarchies that yield valuable somethings. Way to nail that down, Peterson. I can now apply this in my life.
The balance between conservatism and originality might therefore be properly struck, socially, by bringing the two types of persons together. But someone must determine how best to do that, and that requires a wisdom that transcends mere temperamental proclivity. Because the traits associated with creativity, on the one hand, and comfort with the status quo, on the other, tend to be mutually exclusive, it is difficult to find a single person who is balanced both properly, who is therefore comfortable working with each type, and who can attend, in an unbiased manner, to the necessity for capitalizing on the respective forms of talent and proclivity.
Okay, so on a person-to-person level, the conservatives and, what is he calling it this time? Originals must be balanced by a wise third party. Why? Why does this need an intermediary? A person who is wise and advanced enough to be able to be both conservative and creative. The examples in the next section will inadvertently highlight the difficulty of this person being a non-fictional entity. For social institutions, not even at the personal level here in this life advice book, but for the social hierarchies that produce valuable somethings, why does there need to be a person or persons overseeing the balance between keeping things as they are or changing things up? Why can't the give and take between these two sides just happen organically? But fear not, dear viewer. You can work to become this wise intermediary.
But the development of that ability can at least begin with an expansion of conscious wisdom, the articulated realization that conservatism is good, with a set of associated dangers, and that creative transformation, even of the radical sort, is also good, with a set of associated dangers. Learning this deeply, truly appreciating the need for both viewpoints, means at least the possibility of valuing what truly diverse people have to offer, and of being able to recognize when the balance has swung too far in one direction.
I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time not reading this as a cult-like mantra. Conservatism is good. Creative transformation is good. Throw in some stuff from earlier this chapter and you're pretty well on your way to a full litany. The beginner is good. The peer is good. The authority is good.
The gun is good. The gun is good!
I imagine the lobs are saying that I'm reading too much into this, and maybe I am, but come on. The repeated emphasis that all these different things are good has a weird vibe. There also seems to be a jab at diversity here. That truly modifier is hinting at a lot. Now, let's take a topical issue that is always loved by advertisers on this platform. Reproductive rights. Why do I, a progressive who sides with the argument that I have autonomy over my body, need to respect the stance that it actually isn't my body as soon as an egg is fertilized? I understand and can even respect people who have ethical or moral issues with abortion, and they are free to do with their body as they wish. But the legal situation in Texas is clearly codifying that the woman does not matter as much as the bundle of cells inside her. Why should I respect that when it clearly doesn't respect me or other people? Or is that an instance where the balance has swung too far? If only he would be more specific or give examples so we would know what he's intending here. So strange that he would leave it in this abstract or story form.
To manage complex affairs properly, it is necessary to be cold enough in vision to separate the power-hungry and self-serving pseudo-advocate of the status quo from the genuine conservative, and the self-deceptive, irresponsible rebel without a cause from the truly creative. And to manage this means to separate those factors within the confines of one's own soul, as well as among other people.
This feels Jungy to me. I think because he's saying we need to start dissecting our soul. But once again, we're being told about these artificial people, in this case particular conservatives and creatives, without any real method provided for figuring out why they're ingenuine. There's just a hint with self-serving or irresponsible, but those are terribly subjective. I don't know how many times I've seen the argument thrown around that a person getting pregnant when they weren't intending to is purely irresponsible on their part. Although, catching some contagious medical ailment could be seen as irresponsible because you could have been more proactive in avoiding it. But thanks to the wonders of modern medicine, we have treatments so that you don't have to suffer for being an imperfect human. If somebody catches the preggers, they shouldn't have to bring another life into the world unless they want to. Also, it would be irresponsible as a society to force people to raise children they aren't able to for whatever reason. Peterson sadly breaks his streak of not abandoning numbered lists after he gets past the first item, while describing how to separate your conservatism and creativity. You need to understand consciously that conservatism and creativity are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. This means that subordination to the status quo, his definition for discipline, is the necessary precursor for creative transformation. Therefore, creative transformation is constrained.
Creative transformation must strain against limits. It has no use and cannot be called forth unless it is struggling against something. It is for this reason that the great genie, the granter of wishes, God in a microcosm, is archetypally trapped in the tiny confines of a lamp and subject, as well, to the will of the lamp's current holder. Genius, is a combination of possibility and potential and extreme constraint.
This is the closest he comes to actually informing us how to separate the conservatism and creative transformation-ism in yourself or in others. They're linked, and you can't have one without the other. How does that help separate them? Am I just being dense? If I wanted to be uncharitable, I'd say he's talking out his ass, hence the obtuse nature of everything except for stories based on people he's interacted with. But let's take a closer look, shall we? At this point, this subtle shift from a more broad creativity to creative transformation is feeling a bit like a moving target. Conservatism is the opposing force or personality type or whatever against the liberal left, creativity, and now creative transformation. It's almost a bit meta that conservatism would be the fixed point that the shifting opposing force would orient against. Speaking of creativity, I don't think it's something that can only exist when boxed in. It seems like such a weird boundary to put on creativity. But of course, he would frame creative transformation as having to come from a place rooted in tradition and only possible as a struggle against something. All of this vagueness gives Peterson the ability to potentially explain everything in this framework, and not in a good way. By leaving things this abstract, he's able to make it fit for any creative transformation, from very, very prehistoric times to the modern day. But the cost of this lack of specificity is that it ultimately doesn't end up buying us much. It's basically another deepity. Etymology time, as is tradition when Peterson gets cute with the wordplay. Genius comes from Latin, where it gradually changed meaning from a guiding spirit to how we use it today. Genie in this context comes from the Arabic jinn, which refers to any number of supernatural creatures who may be helpful or harmful. Given Peterson's love of Disney and his emphasis on the lamp, he's probably talking about the genie in Aladdin. And because he's a traditionalist, probably the Robin Williams one, not Will Smith. One of those rare instances where tradition may be right. Quick side note, the origins for the Aladdin story appear to be a bit of a rabbit hole itself, but historically jinn and rubbing lamps are more of a recent thing. Now, the origin for jinn is apparently unclear. Maybe it's coming from the Latin genius, maybe it's Aramaic, maybe it's Persian, maybe it's something else. So we'll leave the wordplay at a draw, but not before noting that this aside about the genie being God in a microcosm. Quite the heretical statement there. This archetypal business, though, that gets a solid harumph from me. Archetypally trap my ass. Unless archetypes has changed to meaning tropes in modern popular media, and I just didn't know. As we just talked about, in traditional mythology, jinn and lamps giving wishes were the very, very rare exception rather than the rule. We're reaching the end of the section, so naturally that means it's time for the style-mad list of things to occur, with a bunch of creativity this, conservatism that, creativity this, conservatism that. Basically, it's a rehash of the good and bad sides of conservatism and creativity from earlier this chapter, with the bad side now being referred to as its dark aspect. The only real new thing comes at the very end with a question to ask yourself.
Are you the real thing, or its opposite? And the answer is, inevitably, that you are some of both, and perhaps far more of what is shadowy than you might like to realize. That is all part of understanding the complexity we each carry within us.
I would love to give you some context for what this real thing he's referring to is, and I have to say, I can't really tell you for certain, even with the full text. It could be the wisdom of true conservatism. It could be the brilliance of creative endeavor. Maybe intelligent and cautious conservatism? From the broader context of the chapter, I'd hazard a guess that it's someone who is meeting his demand of being genuinely conservative and creative, but that's certainly not explicitly stated here. Now that we know how to separate your conservatism from your creativity, we need to understand the personality that can do that. And because this is a complex problem, stories are the answer. Of course they are. To get through life, we can copy what the protagonists do in their stories and vicariously learn from their successes and failures.
The good moves us upward and ahead, and evil drags us backward and down. Great stories are about characters in action, and so they mirror the unconscious structures and processes that help us translate the intransigent world of facts into the sustainable, functional, reciprocal social world of values.
That footnote is Peterson musing about the "what would Jesus do" thing that was big some years ago. We'll sidestep another rant to just comment. It would be nice if more American Christians could embody that sentiment more fully. He seems to have a relatively narrow, Hollywood-ish view of what makes a good story. Stories don't always have to be this black and white about morality and success to be engaging. If anything, this demand could be seen as a result of the Hays Code. Maybe this is a matter of personal preference, but I generally find deconstructions of the hero's journey more interesting. But that isn't going to mesh with this book for a couple reasons. First, Peterson's general tendency to write as if his opinions are truth with a capital T. And second, this sort of deconstruction of a story is postmodern. We can't have that. Not on his watch.
The properly embodied hierarchy of values, including the value of conservatism and its twin creative transformation, finds its expression as a personality in narrative, an ideal personality. Every hierarchy has something at its pinnacle. It is for this reason that a story, which is a description of the action of a personality, has a hero. And even if that someone is the anti-hero, it does not matter. The anti-hero serves the function of identifying the hero through contrast, as the hero is what the anti-hero is most decidedly not. The hero is the individual at the peak, the victor, the champion, the wit.
There's that ideal personality again. It's almost funny that he's going to try to demonstrate this ideal personality through fictional characters. Does Peterson not fully understand anti-heroes in stories? What is this identifying the hero through contrast business? Isn't part of the point of anti-heroes that they are less idealized or morally perfect versions of heroes? The anti-hero trope page, including Shinji Ikari as an example, provides a perfect discussion point. I recently watched Evangelion, the original TV run, End of Eva, Rebuild, all of it. It's certainly grown on me, so I convinced Dr. Mr. the husband to watch Rebuild with me, and he hated it. Why? Baka Shinji. My husband physically has a hard time dealing with cringe. Shush. So Shinji's nearly constant struggles with practically everything made for a difficult watch. But Shinji is a deconstruction of the heroes in fighting mech stories. He is arguably a more realistic version of what someone forced into that situation would go through. Also, back in reality where most of us live, sometimes the good guy, despite doing everything they can, still won't win.
The stories we create, watch, listen to, and remember center themselves on actions and attitudes we find interesting, compelling, and worthy of communication as a consequence of our personal experience with both admirable and detestable people, or fragments of their specific attitudes and actions, or because of our proclivity to share what has gripped our attention with those who surround us.
It seems like so much personal preference, though it is very on brand for Peterson to be pulling greater cosmic meaning from this. But that last part is buying Peterson some serious wiggle room. Oh, the personal experience with people not capturing your sense of things? It's because it grabbed your attention then. Peterson goes on to say that stories can be directly crafted from personal experience, sometimes more inspired by the events of, with several people being mushed into one character. With the juxtaposition, the coming pivot makes me wonder if he's hinting that the client stories of his are more on the amalgamation side of things. He refers back to the client story from the start of the chapter, the guy who benefited from going out and being more social. This client's being brought up again because Peterson wants to emphasize that this socialization process also brought out his creative side by way of photography and later drawing. And Peterson initially viewed his work as psychologically useful, but not as worthwhile artistic endeavors in their own right. At least until the client was talented enough to win Peterson over. I hope Peterson didn't have these exacting standards with his kids or grandkids, especially when they were young. He had seen these creative developments in a couple other clients as well.
In addition, I had read accounts of clinical cases and personal development by Carl Jung, who noted that the production of increasingly ordered and complex geometrical figures, often circles within squares, or the reverse, regularly accompanied an increase in organization of the personality.
What? Why? Seriously? At least give me a reference for some context on this, because I am not digging through all of Jung's work to find it. Why would geometrical doodles have anything to do with a more organized personality? Well, let's let Peterson explain.
What I observed in these clients was, therefore, not only the reconstruction of the psyche as a consequence of further socialization and the valuation of social institutions, but the parallel transformation of primarily interior processes indicated by a marked increase in the capacity to perceive and to create what was elegant, beautiful, and socially valued. My clients had learned not only to submit properly to the sometimes arbitrary but still necessary demands of the social world, but to offer to that world something it would not have had access to had it not been for their private creative work.
I'm glad his clients were able to find outlets of creative expression, but how do you disentangle the creative works improving just by effect of sheer practice and the proposed psyche reconstruction? Perhaps Peterson's point would be that you can't separate the two, but the number of creatives who produce masterpieces while dealing with some serious shit would suggest that this is a tenuous relationship. The relationship between creativity and some psych disorders would further suggest that this creativity developing as a person's mental health improves isn't fully capturing reality. That art therapy has some roots in psychoanalysis shouldn't be surprising, I suppose. This creativity coming as a product of greater submission to the social world, and therefore all its hierarchies and institutions, makes me a bit sad, if I'm being honest. Confusingly, he brings up and then immediately drops his granddaughter again, saying that in addition to her hierarchy work by way of pointing at things, she also displayed some creative ability. Pivot to an observation of the general tendency for people to try and find one agreed upon meaning of a story. The abundance of movie ending explain channels on YouTube would support this point, although that doesn't mean that everyone has a strive to reach a Borg-like consensus on the true meaning of a work.
Now, the idea that a story is a form of communication and entertainment is one of those facts that appears self-evident upon first consideration, but that becomes more mysterious the longer it's pondered. If it is true that a story has a point, then it is clear that it is pointing to something. But what? And how? What constitutes pointing is obvious when it is an action specifying a particular thing, or a person by a particular person, but much less obvious when it is something typifying the cumulative behavior, shall we say, of a character in a story.
Forgive my cynicism, but it seems like the point of some stories is give us money. Feeling things as a consequence of that story is a means to an end. Analyzing stories for what they're deeply communicating, especially through the sort of symbological lens that Peterson tends to use, seems like a kind of postmodern move. I'm going to preface this next part by saying I don't think Peterson's newfound interest in a certain British author is because of her recent manifesto and media attention. It's almost surprising Harry Potter didn't feature into his work before now, given the heavy-handed symbolism in the work. But maybe he never really had time to get invested into it until his recent bed rest and stuff. Peterson goes on for a bit about the duality of the main character's actions, where they mostly follow the rules, except for when they don't.
There is a strong implication throughout the series that what is good cannot be simply encapsulated by mindless or rigid rule following, no matter how disciplined that following or how vital the rules so followed. What this all means is that the Harry Potter series does not point to drone-like subservience to social order as the highest of moral virtues. What supersedes that obedience is not so obvious that it can be easily articulated, but it is something like, follow rules, except when doing so undermines the purpose of those selfsame rules, in which case take the risk of acting in a manner contrary to what has been agreed upon as moral.
Get your damn boats ready because I'm going to say something controversial, yet brave. I never got into Harry Potter. I read the first two and most of the third when they were new before giving up on the series altogether. Although, some grad students in my program were really into the series, so it's not necessarily I'm out of the target demo or something. I never really cared for Rowling's writing style or the world she was building. Plus, the practically assured Deus Ex Machina and Shyamalan-level twists, and it just pulled me out of it. So, what Peterson sees as demonstrative of what could be boiled down to a chaotic good moral orientation strikes me as rules being written in just so they can be broken, to make the characters seem more cool or savvy in their problem solving. Peterson brought up the Marauders map in his discussion. If you aren't a Potterhead, it's a physical map of the school with little dots representing where people are. In his interpretation, that the map's activation requires the person to say, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." But Harry and friends used it to regularly but carefully break the rules, and are equally regularly and carefully rewarded for doing so, means the map matches the ethics of its users. This then means that good cannot be captured by rules. To me, this seemed more like a wizard did it thing that allowed characters to advance the plot. Sometimes a magic map is just a magic map. After Peterson's granddaughter figured out pointing and all of that, she figured out how to understand stories. When she was not quite 3, for about half a year, she insisted she was Disney's Pocahontas.
This was a staggering act of sophisticated thought, as far as I was concerned. She had been given a Pocahontas doll, which became one of her favorite toys, along with a baby doll, also very well loved, who she named after her grandmother, my wife Tammy. When she played with the infant doll, Ellie was the mother. With Pocahontas, however, the situation differed. That doll was not a baby, and Ellie was not its mother. My granddaughter regarded herself, instead, as the grown Pocahontas, mimicking the doll, which was fashioned like a young woman, as well as a character who served as a lead in the Disney movie of the same name, which she raptly observed on 2 separate occasions.
Of all the Disney movies to have as a favorite.
When they see how I glitter.
Knowing what I do with kids, I'm surprised at the low number of times his granddaughter has seen that movie. Although, it could be a subtle flux of Peterson's parenting style, since he refused to be dominated by his son at that age. Peterson's explanation for why this was a sophisticated move on her part will come in a little bit, and it's underwhelming. Peterson says that Disney's Pocahontas has many similarities to Harry Potter and Friends. This is because she was to be married to someone who's too rule-bound, and instead fell in love with the European John Smith, representative of that which falls outside known territory but is potentially of great value. This means Pocahontas was pursuing a higher moral order by breaking her culture's rule hierarchy. Similar to Rowling's characters?
This is the moral of both narratives. Follow the rules until you are capable of being a shining exemplar of what they represent, but break them when those very rules now constitute the most dire impediment to the embodiment of their central virtues. And Elizabeth Scarlett, not yet 3 years of age, had the intrinsic wisdom to see this as the point of what she was watching, the Disney movie, and using as a role-playing aid, the doll Pocahontas. Her perspicacity in this regard bordered on the unfathomable.
And then she defended her thesis on this morality represented by Pocahontas, most beloved of Disney films, and everybody clapped. Seriously, I sincerely doubt that she was doing any of this when she insisted that she be called Pocahontas. At 3, which is to say nothing of Peterson's interpretation of Pocahontas. Very Eurocentric, much colonialism. Wow.
The same set of ideas. Respect for the rules, except when following those rules means disregarding or ignoring or remaining blind to an even higher moral principle, is represented with stunning power in 2 different gospel narratives, which serve, regardless of your opinion about them, as central traditional or classical stories portraying a personality for the purposes of evoking imitation.
This is only really carrying a problem forward for most of this chapter. He's talking about the hierarchy of rules and values, but not specifying why certain rules or values should be favored more than others, other than they're traditional. Some rules value people will be higher up the hierarchy than others. As long as they are genuine, there is no Peterson problem. But information on how to suss out genuine people or rules isn't provided. Which, on the one hand, cool, I guess. He's not telling people what to put up at the top. Not yet, at least. But on the other, it seems like there's an assumption that people will be of the same mind as Peterson. It hasn't really come up in Beyond Order so far, but it was in the original 12 Rules, the companion book to Beyond Order, so I think it's fair game. In 12 Rules, Peterson had a pretty traditional view on relationships and the different roles people were supposed to have, be it social, gender, or orientation. One of the blind spots that was a recurring issue was his instructions for the reader to speak and live their truth. Doing any less would be letting tyranny win. The blind spot was for gender, romantic, or sexual minorities who are still fighting for the right to live their truth. Giving this life advice for people, then making exceptions for identities he doesn't consider valid, is fucked up. I bring this up because this seems similar. Arguably, people fighting for their basic rights are pursuing a higher moral principle than abiding by the current social or legal rules. But Peterson has said that these people need to stop. Think of their families, abide by the cultural rules because it has their best interests in mind, regardless of what they feel to be the case.
But I wrote the book. I thought it was a very fair treatment.
Makes you wonder, too, when you're doing analysis of the outcomes of surgery.
Oh, we're back to talking about the
take
dicks.
Into account the effects of that on the immediate family members, if that's a valid scientific question.
What?
You know what I mean? That, like, you could say, look,
God.
the only person who's ever affected by a surgery is the person upon whom the surgery is performed. And perhaps that's the case, and perhaps that's a reasonable perspective, but we are embedded in familial structures, and if a surgical procedure makes person A temporarily happy, or even maybe happy over the long run, but devastates 5 other people, it seems to me that it's at least worth asking the question of whether
Oh my god. Oh my god. So somebody's not allowed to get a bottom surgery because their family's gonna be upsetty spaghetti. Back to this particular quote. Part of the point of the gospel may be a moral template for people to copy, but it also seems to be the sales pitch for Christianity. It's the good news to be shared, after all.
In the first, Christ is presented, even as a child, as a master of the Jewish tradition. This makes him fully informed as to the value of the past and portrays him as characterized by the respect typical, say, of the genuine conservative. According to the account in Luke 2:42-52, Jesus' family journeyed to Jerusalem every year at the Jewish holiday of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast.
Or, this story sets up Jesus as the Jewish Messiah by checking off some of the prophecy boxes. Something Peterson, Dr. Maps of Meaning himself, seems to forget or ignore is that these stories are stories. They aren't primary historical accounts of things that happened.
A paradox emerges, however, as the entirety of the gospel accounts are considered, one closely associated with the tension between respect for tradition and the necessity for creative transformation. Despite the evidence of his thorough and even precocious understanding and appreciation of the rules, the adult Christ repeatedly and scandalously violates the Sabbath traditions, at least from the standpoint of the traditionalists in his community, and much to his own peril.
Peterson's example is a cornfield journey where Jesus and friends ate property that wasn't theirs, then told off the biblical fuzz. Then it's time to talk about the Codex Bezae. Peterson has a footnote describing what a codex is and what is contained in this particular one. He says that this non-canonical codex gives deeper insight on this tension between respect for tradition and creative transformation that played out in the cornfield. Additionally,
it contains an account of Christ addressing someone who, like him, has broken a sacred rule. On that same day, observing one working on the Sabbath, Jesus said to him, "O man, if indeed thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art accursed and a transgressor of the law."
Stop! You violated the law.
The 12th and final reference of this chapter is to a website describing the Codex Bezae, mostly focusing on where the manuscript itself originated and traveled. The actual source of the quote Peterson uses is nowhere to be seen. Solid referencing as ever, Peterson. So, a person is blessed if they are knowingly breaking a rule, but cursed if they don't? I looked around a little for this to figure out what's going on, because on its face, it's pretty messed up. First, this codex is non-canonical, so it's not part of the typical, traditional, commonly agreed upon Christian dealy. Second, what it means isn't clear. Some places are saying that it may reflect an early Christian practice that got phased out. A different interpretation is that if you're working on the Sabbath while believing there's a new Sabbath in town, you're good to go because you're on Jesus' team. Otherwise, cursed ye be. But again, this isn't in the canon, so there isn't really an official meaning to this. Not that that's going to stop Peterson.
What does this statement mean? It sums up the meaning of Rule 1 perfectly. If you understand the rules, their necessity, their sacredness, the chaos they keep at bay, how they unite the communities that follow them, the price paid for their establishment, and the danger of breaking them, but you are willing to fully shoulder the responsibility of making an exception because you see that as serving a higher good, and if you are a person with sufficient character to manage that distinction, then you have served the Spirit rather than the mere law, and that is an elevated moral act. But if you refuse to realize the importance of the rules you are violating and act out of self-centered convenience, then you are appropriately and inevitably damned. The carelessness you exhibit with regard to your own tradition will undo you and perhaps those around you fully and painfully across time.
Ah yes, shouldering responsibility, a concept from the first 12 rules. Lots of humping responsibility in that book. So in order to break rules in Peterson's framework, you need to totally understand the rule you're breaking to know that you breaking the rule is serving a greater good.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good.
Which is then keeping in the spirit of the rule rather than the rule itself. Cool, but what about when the traditional rules are just bad, spirit and all? Like all the stuff about what a traditional Christian family should be like, with certain genders and certain roles. Why should every man and woman in a hetero relationship, or combinations of people in other relationships, need to consider the necessity, sacredness, community unity, prices paid, and dangers of doing something different? What if this relationship recipe isn't so much a law as a centuries-long way of doing things as more a historical artifact than modern chaos fighter? People living in the ways that make sense for them isn't self-centered or damning, Peterson. Insisting that everybody else live the way you want them to is the damning part of this. And sure, little lobsters, Peterson hasn't directly said any of this. It's all open to interpretation. But here's the rub. When you leave it abstract or tied up in stories and Bible verses, it's up to the reader to apply it. Until we get clarification otherwise, this interpretation is valid, especially considered his stated stance on LGBTQ peeps, family, and divorce. But, grain of salt, I suppose, as according to this, I am appropriately and inevitably damned. How strange it must be to live in a reality where people can be appropriately damned. This rule summary seems to be setting an impossibly high standard for people to go against tradition, which is something we saw him do in the original's Rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. So strange for someone branded on personal responsibility to put people in boxes with such high walls that they can't climb out. There's some more Bible stuff along the same lines, and how Jesus ruffling the Pharisees' jimmies led to his crucifixion.
These stories portray the existential dilemma that eternally characterizes human life. It is necessary to conform, to be disciplined, and to follow the rules, to do humbly what others do. But it is also necessary to use judgment, vision, and the truth that guides conscience to tell what is right when the rules suggest otherwise. It is the ability to manage this combination that truly characterizes the fully developed personality, the true hero.
This isn't overtly Jungy in and of itself, but I want to remind you about the individuation process. Without getting into the woo weeds, it's basically argued to be a process where you integrate all the different parts of your mind into a cohesive whole. It probably isn't what Peterson's intending here, but this need to mesh the proposed oppositional, conservative, and creative forces reminds me of individuation, albeit a subset. Well, no sense in putting it off further. Time for the traditional end-of-chapter style madness to pour forth in all its unparaphrased glory.
A certain amount of arbitrary ruleness must be tolerated, or welcomed, depending on your point of view, to keep the world and its inhabitants together. A certain amount of creativity and rebellion must be tolerated, or welcomed, depending on your point of view, to maintain the process of regeneration. Every rule was once a creative act, breaking other rules. Every creative act, genuine in its creativity, is likely to transform itself, with time, into a useful rule.
I understand that this is Peterson trying to go beyond order, but it's interesting that the furthest we can get into the Chaos Forest from Order City is the edge of the forest. But I would agree with the gist of this. We live in a society, and to avoid total pandemonium, there are some rules that we need to accept. But it's also important to keep those rules fair. Using the word arbitrary here is an interesting choice. It is possible he's intending the second meaning, unrestrained and autocratic in the use of authority. However, the first meaning, based on random choice or personal whim rather than any reason or system, also works in context. Which is just great. You have to tolerate a certain number of rules that are there for no particularly good reason. Consider me motivated and myself helped. Philosophical rabbit hole. Is not killing each other derived from a once creative act? Answer in the comments. This reminds me of the sort of joke about most safety labels and rules existing as a consequence of someone doing that unsafe thing. Does that mean that peeing on a live electrical wire is a genuine creative act?
It is the living interaction between social institutions and creative achievement that keeps the world balanced on the narrow line between too much order and too much chaos. This is a terrible conundrum, a true existential burden. We must support and value the past, and we need to do that with an attitude of gratitude and respect. At the same time, however, we must keep our eyes open. We, the visionary living, and repair the ancient mechanisms that stabilize and support us when they falter. Thus, we need to bear the paradox that is involved in simultaneously respecting the walls that keep us safe and allowing in enough of what is new and changing so that our institutions remain alive and healthy. The very world depends for its stability and its dynamism on the subsuming of all our endeavors under the perfection, the sacredness of that dual ability. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement.
This isn't overt doom like we saw in the original 12 rules, but it's sort of implied here by this precarious balance Peterson set up. The problem I'm having here is that while he said that we need to respect, value, support, whatever the past and tradition, he hasn't really explained why. Well, I guess he has given a why, but it's not really a satisfactory one for me. There was the stuff about social institutions providing solutions to problems, thereby allowing for a not chaotic perception of the world. I suppose the argument that rules, and thereby tradition, are necessary for sanity are also part of the why. And I think that's it. Beyond that point, he just continues as if this has been established, which just, no, it hasn't. This whole respecting tradition idea is something that needs to be clearly established, rather than taken as writ. Especially when he's trying to make the case, again, that this is something most of us should really leave alone. Only those who really understand the rules are allowed to try tweaking them. The creative conservative. It is a sacred endeavor, after all. This not making sense or it feeling incomplete just indicates that you are not qualified for the job. Set your understanding of the necessity of tradition in perfect order before you unfairly criticize social hierarchies. Or, this piece missing is the fault of the writer, not the reader. And it's not just the justification or explanation for why to value tradition that's incomplete. What creative transformation entails is also left unclear. Which, as I said a little bit ago, cool, Peterson isn't telling the reader exactly how to live their life. But not having some form of guidance for what is meant by this seems like a huge oversight. There's a couple things to say about this rule and chapter. First, something I forgot to do right out the gate but meant to was bring in Peterson's description of this rule from the overture. He does describe the relationship between social structures and mental health, as he sees it. I'll give him that. You may recall me not being very satisfied or convinced by his reasoning, though. And now that we're at the end of this chapter, did he really make the case that social structures need to be updated by creative people to stay vital? I guess part of the problem here is that there is a lot of meaning hiding in how these terms are being used. Social structures can mean things like various types of hierarchies to traditional rules. Creative people aren't just creative people in the details. They are people who are not only creative, but also a certain type of conservative. In this context, vitality means that these traditional rules and social structures need to keep on living. So we can't kill off things that are no longer working or appropriate. Second, the reader is told to not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement, but, as I said a little bit ago, the why for that isn't really clearly established. Same goes for what's meant by a social institution or creative achievement. Third, so much of this chapter seems tangential to the core rule, especially once we got the description of it right towards the end of the chapter. What was the point of talking about games and what makes one a good games player? Why were there several sections trying to justify hierarchies and the meritocracy of the people up top? I suppose this could be a way to set up social institutions and their necessity, but if that's the case, that link could have been more clear. The amount of time spent with clients didn't add much helpful information. While I do appreciate specific examples, demonstrating a creative conservative personality by way of Harry Potter, Pocahontas, and Jesus, so much Jesus, could have been accomplished more concisely. If I was editing this, my feedback would have been to focus on the core points and build up as necessary from there. Okay, so the point is, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions and creative achievement. What is meant by social institutions and creative achievement? Why are these two things being lumped together? What does careless denigration look like? What are the consequences of it? If the reader isn't to do this, what should they do instead? Granted, some of these pieces are explicitly in this chapter, but part of the issue is that they are buried in so much lobster fluff. The reader shouldn't have to sift through everything carefully to find a point. Finally, acceptance of this rule seems to require a conservative mindset. It builds on the assumption that the old ways of doing things is generally the way to go, with the concession that tradition be modified only as much as necessary to keep it current. For some things that might work, but for others, a revolutionary overhaul can be what's needed. To bring up a weird piece of YouTube history, it's like the comment from Boogie about gay marriage. He tried to make the case that people push for gay marriage too aggressively, that they really just needed to be patient and wait for everyone else to come around. But that ignores so many issues, like how much the legality of a marriage can matter when it comes to healthcare, both in terms of access to health insurance or being allowed to visit one's partner in the hospital, how the couple is treated by the government for financial assets or property, and the general sense of the government or country not viewing this particular relationship configuration as valid. Trying to change minds and hope they'll come around to accepting gay people and their relationships eventually results in however many years of extra emotional and physical labor for this minority group to maybe get equal rights, but only if the majority deems it so. Which is hard when the majority may be voting against something that in no way affects them and are being traditional assholes. But enough about that. In continuing a tradition from the first 12 Rules series, let's have an alternate piece of life advice that isn't so rooted in hierarchies and traditionalism. In keeping with this book's alleged expedition into chaos from order, perhaps the lesson here is to try to encourage growth in yourself and others. It's important to know your boundaries and what you're comfortable with, but it's also important to challenge yourself. Take up a new hobby, learn a new skill, just expand your knowledge base even. While challenging yourself, it's okay to not know what you're doing and make mistakes. That's part of how we learn. And you may need help from others in order to improve. But if you keep at it, at some point you may be in a position to help others, which is pretty cool. I'd also like to emphasize that our focus shouldn't be on protecting traditional rules or values because they're bequeathed to us by our ancestors. We should be working to maximize everyone's well-being. Everyone. Not trying to force people onto the culturally prescribed life path if it doesn't suit them. And with that, we are finally done with Beyond Order's first rule. Up next is imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that, which has more alchemy and Quidditch than you can shake a broom at. So, until next time, bye!